My name is Iris Calloway. I'm 35, and I learned exactly where I stood in my own family while lying on a backboard in an emergency room with a stranger holding pressure on my forehead. 7 weeks before that night, I'd given birth to a boy named Theo. Then, on a Thursday in late October, my car came down a wet off-ramp too fast, the back end let go, and a delivery van put its grill through my driver's door. I came to with a fractured collarbone, 4 stitched lacerations on my scalp, and a left wrist that wouldn't close into a fist. My husband Marcus was somewhere on Lake Superior on a freighter, no signal, 2 days from a phone. Theo was home with a sitter who had to leave at 10. There was one person within 30 minutes who could take my son for the night. My mother lived 15. She said no. She gave the sitter one sentence over the phone, and that sentence is the only reason you and I are sitting here together right now. We can't just walk out on Kyle's housewarming, Iris. You'll figure it out. You always do. Kyle is my younger brother. The housewarming was for a lake house I'll tell you a great deal about before we're done, because I paid for a piece of it without ever knowing I had. What I did from that emergency room over the next 10 minutes undid 7 years and a number I'd never let myself add up. And even that isn't the part that broke them. The part that broke them came hours later, when the doors to my room swung open and an 81-year-old man walked in slow, with a thermos under one arm and a folded gray quilt over the other, and he said the thing none of them ever expected anyone to say out loud. Welcome back to Burned Bridges Club, the place where the quiet ones finally stop covering for everybody else. If your steadiness has ever been treated like a line of credit nobody intends to repay, stay with me. Tell me in the comments who actually showed up the night you fell. And subscribe, because the people in this story counted on me forgetting, and I want you to remember with me. Let me start with the phone, because that's where the floor gave out. I surfaced from somewhere gray and chemical, and the first thing I registered was a woman's voice asking my name like she'd asked it a few times already. My collarbone felt like a hot wire. There was tape pulling at my scalp, and a brace cinched around my neck I couldn't see past. A nurse named Pell, young, careful hands, was clipping something to my finger. My phone sat on the gurney rail where the medics had bagged my things, and it was buzzing. The sitter's name lit the screen. Becca. 19, lived 2 doors down, good with Theo. I got the phone to my ear with the hand that still worked. She was apologizing before I could speak. Her ride was coming at 10, her mom had a shift, she'd called my mother like I'd told her to in the emergency contacts, and my mother had said she couldn't come. I asked Becca to say that part again. She did, and behind her thin teenage voice I could hear it, faint and unmistakable on the line. Music. The flat thump of a speaker outdoors. A woman laughing, then another, then the specific bright noise of a party that is going extremely well for everybody at it. My mother had answered the phone with a drink in her hand and a son to celebrate, and she had told a 19-year-old that her grandson would have to be somebody else's problem tonight. I didn't cry. I want you to sit with that because the woman in the hospital bed is supposed to fall apart, and I want you to know that I didn't, and that the not crying is its own kind of information about how I was raised. I told Becca to stay 1 more hour if she could, that I'd have someone there before her ride came. Then I closed my eyes and did the thing I am very good at, the thing that had quietly hollowed me out for years without my noticing. I started solving the problem. You should know who I was before that night because it explains why my family handled me the way you handle a tool that has never once failed. You don't thank a tool, you just reach for it. I grew up in a narrow house on the east side of Grand Rapids where the upstairs was cold from October to April, and nobody ever called the furnace guy because the furnace guy cost money we were always going to have next month. My father Gerald drove a parts truck and had a heart that started skipping in his 50s. My mother Diane has never in my memory been wrong about anything, which is a different thing from being right. And my brother Kyle was born when I was 4, and arrived, as far as the family was concerned, as the answer to a question the rest of us hadn't known we were failing to be. Kyle was charming the way weather is charming. He'd warm a whole room and then leave you standing in the cold wondering what you'd said. By the time he was 20, he'd started and folded 2 businesses. By the time he was 30, he'd started and folded 4. Each one, my mother explained to relatives, had been killed by bad luck, bad partners, a bad economy, a bad landlord. Never by Kyle. Kyle was a visionary in a world too small for him. I was the other kind. I paid my way through community college on the closing shift at a pharmacy, counting other people's pills and reconciling the register to the penny, because if it was off by $1, I had to stay until I found the dollar. I liked finding the dollar. I transferred, finished an accounting degree, sat for exams, and by 31, I was a senior compliance auditor at a regional bank downtown. My whole job, the thing they paid me well to do, was to follow money and confirm that it actually went where people swore it had gone. I read ledgers the way other people read faces. Numbers never softened the truth to spare my feelings. I respected them for that. Marcus and I married at 28. He works the Lakers, the long iron freighters that haul taconite and grain across the Great Lakes from spring thaw to winter ice. He's gone for stretches, and when he's gone, he's truly gone, out past the reach of a cell tower in the middle of an inland sea. We waited a long time on a baby, partly because the family always seemed to have an emergency that needed me first, and the emergencies all had Kyle's fingerprints on them. Here's the part I never said out loud to anyone. Not to Marcus, not to my closest friend, not to the woman who did my taxes. For 7 years, I had carried my parents. It didn't start as a plan. It started one February when my father's cardiologist wanted a procedure the insurance fought, and my mother called me sobbing, and I said the words that would define the next 7 years of my life. I'll handle it. I co-signed when they refinanced the house because their credit couldn't carry it alone and mine could. Then the mortgage became, quietly, mine to make sure cleared every month. Then it was my father's specialty medication, the one that ran $1,100 even after the copay card. Then it was the truck Kyle leased and stopped paying on, which I covered so the lease wouldn't wreck the credit I'd attached my own name to. Then it was the phone bill, the property taxes the 1 year they came up short, the furnace they finally did replace. I set most of it to draft automatically out of an account I kept separate from the one Marcus and I shared, because some animal part of me knew that if Marcus ever saw the full picture laid end to end, he'd ask me a question I didn't have an honest answer to. And I'm an auditor. I keep records on everyone. So I kept one on myself, a plain spreadsheet I never let myself total, just rows and rows of dates and amounts going back years, like sediment. I told myself it was love. I told myself I was the only one steady enough to hold it. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, was that being the load-bearing wall had become the only way I knew how to be in the room. If I held the house up, they could never tear me out of it. There's a memory I never tell anyone because it sounds small until you've lived 100 versions of it. I was 9. The school had a science fair, and I'd built a working model of a lock and dam, the kind that runs the rivers Marcus would one day spend his life on, though I didn't know that yet. I'd cut every piece myself with a coping saw in the cold garage. It won first in the whole school. The same week, Kyle, who was 5, drew a dog with 4 legs and the right number of eyes, and my mother put that drawing on the refrigerator and left it there for 2 years. My ribbon went in a drawer. When I asked about it, she said, "Oh, Iris, you don't need a refrigerator. You know you're smart. Your brother needs the encouragement." That was the whole arrangement in one sentence, handed to a 9-year-old. Kyle got encouraged. I got assumed, and I spent the next 26 years trying to be so undeniable that they'd finally have to put me on the door, never once understanding that the door was never the prize, and the prize was a thing they'd decided long ago I'd be fine without. That was the architecture of my whole life. And on a wet Thursday in October, with a brace on my neck and a phone in my working hand, the wall I'd built finally got tested, and I learned which way it had been leaning the entire time. The first thing I did from that bed was not revenge. I want to be precise about that, because revenge is a lazy word and this wasn't lazy. The first thing I did was get my son taken care of, because that is what I do, and because a problem in front of me has never once cared about my feelings, so I'd long ago stopped letting my feelings vote. I scrolled to a name I'd saved months earlier and never used. Dasha. I'd met her in a prenatal class, a labor and delivery nurse with a laugh you could hear through a wall, the kind of friend you make in the strange foxhole of late pregnancy and then half expect to lose afterward. We hadn't lost each other. I'd told her once, half joking, that if the world ever ended, I'd want her in my bunker. She picked up on the second ring. I gave her the shape of it in about 6 sentences, flat as a Tuesday, the way you talk when crying would cost time you don't have. Crash. Hospital. Marcus on the water. Becca leaving at 10. Theo home and fine and needing somebody. Dasha didn't say, "Oh my God." She didn't ask where my mother was. She said, "I'm putting on shoes. Text me your door code and which bottle's in the fridge." 40 minutes later, she sent me a photo. Theo asleep on his back in his crib, one fist up by his ear the way he sleeps, a swaddle done so cleanly it could have been from a manual. Under it she wrote, "He's perfect. You take care of you. I've got him as long as you need." I looked at that photo for a long time, in the dark of that curtained bay. Pell, the young nurse, came back to check the line in my arm and asked, gently, the question they're trained to ask. Did I have family who could be with me? Someone they should call? "It's handled," I said. She blinked. People always blink. They've braced themselves to comfort you through a collapse, and when you don't collapse, when you just keep moving down the list, they don't know where to put their hands. I wasn't being cold. I was triaging, the way you triage when you've spent 35 years being the only adult in a house full of adults. My son was warm and watched and safe. My husband was somewhere on the water and unreachable, which meant there was nothing to do about him but wait, so I set him down in my mind like a closed file. My collarbone would knit, the lacerations would heal, and there was exactly one item left, one I had carried for 7 years and never once allowed my thumb to touch, and now my working hand was free, and the painkillers had cleared, and my head was very, very quiet. I opened my banking app. The login screen glowed in that dark little bay like a window with the curtains drawn. I knew my way through it blind. There's a screen for scheduled payments, and mine was a museum of my own obedience. The mortgage draft. The medication card on file at the specialty pharmacy. The truck lease auto pay. The phone account where I was the billing owner. The utilities for a house I did not live in, set to draft from an account that was mine alone. I'd never added them up. The total had always felt like a door I couldn't walk back through once I'd seen what was on the other side. But I'm an auditor, and that night I finally did to my own life what I do to a bank's books. I made myself look. I pulled the private spreadsheet up beside the app and let it sum the column I'd never summed. $338,000. Some change after that I'm not going to pretend I remember, because the comma between the 300 and the 38 is what stopped my breath. $338,000 had moved out of my life, one quiet automatic payment at a time over 7 years, while my mother told the relatives at Thanksgiving that she and Gerald did just fine on their own, thank you. They'd always been careful. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too. I felt the specific cold a number gives you when it finally tells you the truth your heart had been lying about. I thought about every winter coat I'd talked myself out of. I thought about the second bedroom Marcus and I hadn't furnished. I thought about telling my husband we should wait 1 more year on the baby because something had come up with my parents, again, and watching his face not argue. Then I started turning it off. I canceled the mortgage autopay first. A small green check and a line of gray text I will hear in my own voice for the rest of my life. Scheduled payment canceled. I removed my card from the specialty pharmacy. I canceled the truck lease draft. I stopped the phone autopay. I shut off the utilities account. It took maybe 90 seconds. 5 small motions of one thumb, and 7 years of being the wall simply stopped. The way water stops when you finally close the valve nobody knew you'd been holding open with your whole body. And then, as I was closing it all out, my eye caught on something in the account history I'd never had reason to scroll to. There was a line item from 18 months back, tied to the home equity account that rode on the mortgage I'd co-signed. A draw. A large one. $45,000, pulled against the equity of a house with my name on the paper, on a date I now placed without any effort at all. 18 months ago was the spring Kyle bought the lake house. I lay there in the dark and let the monitor count my heartbeats, and I did the math an auditor does, the math that isn't really about money. They had taken a second loan against the house I had spent 7 years keeping above water, a house I'd attached my own credit to so my father could keep his heart beating, and they had used it to put a down payment on a lake house for the son who had never once made a payment on anything in his life. And tonight, that lake house was full of people, and the music was good, and my mother had stood in a kitchen I'd helped finance and told a teenager that her grandson would have to wait. That was the night I stopped asking why they did it to me, and started asking why I'd done it to myself. The easy answer, the one a stranger in the comments will offer with the kindest intentions, is that I was a doormat starving for love. That answer is wrong, and if you've ever been the dependable one, you already know it's wrong, because nobody works that hard out of weakness. I did it because somewhere very young I decided that being needed was the same as being safe. Kyle got loved for who he was. I got kept for what I could do. And a child works with the currency she's handed. If the only way I could earn a permanent place in that family was to be the one who fixed things, then I would become the best fixer who ever lived, and I would make myself so structurally necessary that they could never set me down. It worked. That's the cruel part. It worked perfectly. I made myself indispensable, and indispensable is just another word for furniture. You don't thank the wall. You lean on it until the day it isn't there, and then you're furious at the wall for the bruise. My grandmother understood this about me before I understood it about myself. Eleanor, my mother's mother. A small, straight-backed woman who smelled like bread and pencil shavings, and had, by the time she died, exactly 0 patience left for her own daughter. The last good conversation I had with her, 2 summers before she passed, she took my chin in her hand the way she had when I was small, and she said, "You think if you carry enough of it they'll have to keep you." She didn't say it unkindly. She said it like a diagnosis. But carried things get heavy, Iris, and the people who let you carry them never once notice the weight. Your grandfather noticed. You go to him. He's the only one in this family who ever learned to read a room without being told what was in it. I didn't know what she meant then. I thought she was just an old woman talking about her husband. I know what she meant now. She'd been trying to hand me the map a year before I'd need it. Her husband, my grandfather, is named Walt, and 4 hours after my mother chose a housewarming over her grandson, Walt was the one who walked through the door of my hospital room. I'd been moved up to a room by then. It was past midnight. The ward had gone to that hush hospitals get. The carts parked, the lights at half, somewhere a monitor chiming for a patient who wasn't me. I was awake because the painkillers had me floating just under sleep without ever letting me drop into it, and because every time I closed my eyes, I saw $45,000 pulled against a house with my name on it. The door opened slow. He's 81. He moves the way an old crane moves, deliberate, every joint negotiated. He had on the green plaid jacket he's owned my entire life, and a thermos clamped under one arm, and over the other arm he carried a gray quilt I knew on sight because Eleanor had made it, the one that used to live on the back of their couch, the one I'd fallen asleep under 100 times as a kid, waiting for my parents to come get me from a sleepover they were always late to. He didn't say, "Oh, honey." He didn't ask how I felt, which is a question that only ever makes a person in a hospital bed have to manage your fear on top of their own. He came to the side of the bed, looked at the brace and the stitches and the arm, took the whole inventory in one long, unhurried sweep, and then he set the thermos on the tray table and shook the quilt out one-handed and laid it over me on top of the thin hospital blanket. "Your grandmother always said these rooms run cold," he said. She was right about that and most everything else. Then he pulled the vinyl chair close, lowered himself into it with both hands on the armrests, and said the thing. "I came as soon as Sharon called me." Sharon is my aunt, my mother's younger sister, the one decent vein in that side of the family. Took me a while. I don't drive at night so good anymore, so I had the neighbor boy bring me. He folded his hands over the head of his cane. I want you to know I'd have come if it was a paper cut, Iris. I want you to know there was never a version of tonight where I didn't come. I'd held it together through the crash, through Becca, through the spreadsheet, through $338,000 and a $45,000 betrayal hiding in a line of account history. I'd been a wall all night. I came apart in front of my grandfather like a kid. He didn't tell me not to. He just put one heavy spotted hand over my working one and let me, and when it had run its course, he poured a capful of whatever was in that thermos, which turned out to be the terrible weak coffee he's been drinking since the Eisenhower administration. And he made me drink it because his mother had told him coffee fixed shock, and he wasn't about to start doubting his mother at 81. We sat. He didn't fill the quiet. After a while, in the dim, I told him. Not the polished version, the real one. The mortgage and the meds and the truck and the 7 years. The number. And the 45,000 against the house, the night before, while they were all at the lake. He listened to all of it without moving, the way you listen to a doctor giving you a number you already suspected. When I finished, he was quiet a long time. And then he said something I didn't understand until 2 weeks later, when it took the whole family apart in a living room. That lake, he said slowly, sits on my ground. I asked him what he meant. He told me, in that flat gravel voice that never once needed to be raised to fill a room, that the lot Kyle's lake house sat on wasn't bought from a stranger. The whole point, the parcel, the 80 acres of woods and shoreline, and the original family cabin had been Walt and Eleanor's since before my mother was born. Walt had bought it back in the 60s on a pipefitter's wage, a few dollars at a time, the same way I'd bought my degree, and he'd held it free and clear his whole life. 2 years ago, Kyle had come to him with a vision. Of course he had. Kyle would build something beautiful on the family land, a place for everyone, and all Walt had to do was let him carve off a piece of the shoreline lot. There'd be paperwork eventually, Kyle said. They were family. You didn't need lawyers between family. And Walt, who had loved his grandson the way you love the last reckless thing your dead wife adored, had said yes on a handshake and watched a house go up on his land that he had never signed away. Diane told everybody it was theirs, Walt said, told it so many times she believes it now. But there's no deed, Iris. There's no survey, no transfer, no sale. There's a handshake from an old man, and an old man's handshake dies with the old man, and after that, it's just a house sitting on ground that belongs to whoever's name is on the parcel. He looked at me. Your grandmother had me put a thing in motion before she passed. I've been sitting on it a year waiting to be sure. After tonight, I'm sure. I told him I didn't want the land. I told him I didn't want anything. I told him I just wanted to take my son home and never let any of them near him again. I know you don't want it, he said. That's exactly why your grandmother wanted it to be you. The ones who grab for it are the ones you keep it away from. He patted my hand once and stood, the long crane unfolding. You heal up. Get the boy. I'll handle the rest. And Iris, I have been handling things since before your mother could walk. I'm slow. I'm not soft. He stayed in that vinyl chair until the nurse made him go home a little before dawn. He left me the quilt and the thermos and the worst coffee in Michigan. And he left me, for the first time in my adult life, with the strange, weightless feeling of being the one who was carried instead of the one carrying. Marcus made sure 2 days later, got my voicemails all at once, and called me from the dock in a voice I'd never heard him use. I told him most of it on the phone, and the rest in person when he got home. And I want to be clear, because the comments always ask, that he never once said you should have told me. What he said, very quietly, sitting on the edge of our bed with our son asleep on his chest, was, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad. I should have made you tell me. Then he found my spreadsheet, scrolled the whole length of it without a word, closed the laptop and said, Okay, no more. Whatever happens with them, we're done bleeding. The calls started about a week after the autopay stopped, because that's how long it takes for a draft to fail, and a notice to go out, and a family that has never once watched its own money to finally notice the water rising around its ankles. My mother's first voicemail was bright and confused, the voice of a woman who assumes a glitch. Iris, honey, something's wrong with the bank. The mortgage didn't go through, and your father's pharmacy called. Can you look into it when you get a chance? When I get a chance. As if I were the help. The second was sharper. The third dropped the sugar entirely. By the fourth, she'd done the math she'd avoided for 7 years in about 90 seconds, the way you do when it's your own foot in the door, and she understood that the payments hadn't failed. They'd been stopped. By me. From a hospital bed she hadn't bothered to visit. She called me a name I won't repeat about my own mother. Then she demanded I come to the lake house that Sunday for what she called a family conversation, which is the phrase my mother uses for an ambush she intends to win. I almost didn't go. Marcus thought I shouldn't. But Walt called and said he'd be there, and he said, "Bring the boy, bring your husband, bring your folder, and let me bring mine." So I went, because for the first time in my life I wasn't walking into that room alone, and because I had finally learned the difference between avoiding a fight and being afraid of one. The lake house was beautiful. I'll give Kyle that. Or really, I'll give it to the $45,000 of my credit and whatever else he'd borrowed. Big windows on the water, a deck wrapped around 2 sides, a kitchen that cost more than the house I grew up in. The whole clan was there, my parents, Kyle and his girlfriend, Aunt Sharon in the corner, who gave me a small nod that told me whose side she was on. A few cousins arranged on the furniture like a jury that thinks it already knows the verdict. My mother had set it up as a trial, and I was meant to be the defendant. She started before I'd even sat down, before Marcus had finished getting Theo's car seat settled, and she ran the whole script she'd been running my entire life. How I'd abandoned my own father, how the pharmacy had turned him away, how a daughter does not punish her sick parents over hurt feelings, how she'd raised me better than this. And where was the girl who used to be so good, so reliable, so unlike her brother in all the ways that meant a burden and never a gift? I let her finish. That surprised her. She's used to me jumping in to fix the discomfort, to apologize for the temperature of the room. I just held my sleeping son against my good shoulder and let her talk until she ran out of road. Then I took a single sheet of paper out of my bag with my working hand and set it on the big glass coffee table where everyone could see it. It wasn't dramatic, it was an auditor's page. 1 column of dates, 1 column of amounts, 7 years long, and at the bottom, underlined once, the total. $338,000 and some change. Beneath that, in its own box, a single line. The $45,000 draw against the house, 18 months ago, the spring of the lake. I stopped the payments, I said. My voice came out level, which I hadn't been sure it would. All of them. I'll say that plainly so nobody has to wonder. I stopped the mortgage I've been making for 7 years on a house I co-signed so Dad could have his procedure. I stopped the medication card. I stopped Kyle's truck. I stopped the phone, the utilities, all of it. I tapped the box at the bottom. And on the way out, I found this. $45,000, pulled against the equity of that house. My name is on that house. I never signed for that loan. I never knew about it until I was lying in an emergency room with a brace on my neck. The room had gone very still. Kyle had stopped smiling, which is a thing I'd genuinely never seen. 18 months ago, I said, and I looked at the windows, at the water, at the deck, at all of it. Which is when somebody put a down payment on this. My mother reached for the only tool she's ever owned, which is to bury 12 true facts under a landslide of feeling. She started to cry, the loud, sudden kind that has always reset the room in her favor, and she pivoted to the story she's most comfortable in, the one where she is the wounded mother, and I am the cold, ungrateful, dramatic child who keeps a ledger on her own family, who counts, who was always a little bit hard, a little bit unloving, ever since she was small. And I watched it not work. I watched the cousins look at the page on the table instead of at her tears. I watched Aunt Sharon shake her head once, slow. I watched the version of the room my mother had relied on her whole life simply fail to assemble, because the facts were sitting on the glass in one neat column, and you cannot cry your way past arithmetic when everyone in the room can read. She got as far as, "You have always been jealous of your brother. You have twisted every kind thing we ever—" And that's when Walt set the head of his cane against the edge of the coffee table, and the small, hard click of it cut my mother off mid-word, and he reached into the inside of that green plaid jacket and laid his own folder down beside my single page. He took his time with it. He always does. He coaxed a rubber band off that had been on it long enough to leave a groove, and he opened it with the unhurried hands of a man who'd waited a year, maybe longer, for this exact afternoon. And when he spoke, in that dry gravel voice, he didn't aim it at my mother. He aimed it at the whole room, at the jury, so there could be no version of this anyone could later claim not to have heard. "This house," Walt said, "sits on my land." You could feel the room not understand him yet. "Always has," he went on. "The whole parcel, the cabin, the shoreline, every tree out that window. I bought it in 1964, and I've held the deed clear ever since. I never sold this lot. I never deeded it. There's no transfer recorded anywhere in the county, and I'd encourage anyone who doubts me to go and look, because I already did." He slid a document out, thick, a stapled survey with a law firm's name on the cover. Kyle came to me with a vision and a handshake, and I gave an old man's yes, because I'm a fool for anything Eleanor loved. But a handshake isn't a deed, and I'm 81, so I had this drawn up. He looked at my mother then, and there was no cruelty in his face, just a terrible, tired clarity, the clarity of a man who has watched his own daughter become someone his late wife couldn't stand to be in a room with. "The land goes to Iris," he said, "and to the boy. Eleanor wanted it that way before she passed, and after the night they left my granddaughter in a hospital and didn't drive 15 minutes for their grandson, I made it final. There's a life estate in it for you, Diane, and for Gerald. You can live out your days in the old cabin if you want them. Nobody's putting you on the road. But this house," and he nodded once at the beautiful windows, the deck, the water, "this house is on ground that belongs to my granddaughter now. And there's no paper anywhere that says otherwise, because I made very sure there isn't." I have watched my mother's face do a lot of things in 35 years. I had never watched it do that. The wounded matriarch mask, the one she's worn so long I think she's forgotten it's a mask, just slid off, and underneath was raw arithmetic of her own. Because the house she was standing in, the kingdom she'd been queen of for 18 months, the proof she'd been showing the relatives that her family did just fine, had been handed in a stapled survey to the daughter she'd refused to drive 15 minutes for. The room didn't look at me. The room looked at her. What happened next is the part people always hope will be an apology, and I need you braced the way I wish someone had braced me, because it never is. She didn't say she was sorry. She cycled through everything else first, every tool, fast. The tears went hard. Then when the room stayed cold, she swung to my father. "Gerald, Gerald, are you going to sit there? This is your mess too, the surgery, all of it. Are you going to let them do this to us?" My father flinched. And for 1 second, one real second, I saw him lift his head and look at me, and his mouth opened, and I thought, here it is, this is the moment he finally stands. "Iris is right," he said, so quiet I almost missed it. "Di, the money, the lake, it's been—" My mother's head turned toward him, and the look she gave him was 40 years old, and he stopped. He looked back down at his hands, and I felt something in me set him down, gently, for good. Not in anger, the way you set down a heavy thing when your arms finally accept they were never strong enough to fix it. Kyle found his voice last, and it came out as a sneer trying to be a laugh. "You're really going to take my house, over a payment thing. You're going to put it all on a piece of paper from a confused old man." Walt didn't even turn his head. "I'm not confused, Kyle. I'm slow. People your mother's age keep getting those two mixed up, and it's cost them." He pushed the survey an inch toward the center of the table. "You're welcome to lawyer it. Your mother already called 2 of them this week, I'd bet, and I'd bet they both told her the same thing mine told me. Clean title and a sound old man are very hard to argue with. The handshake was never worth the breath it took. You built a beautiful house, son. You just built it on somebody else's ground without asking the somebody. I gathered my page off the glass with my one good hand. There was nothing left to do in that room, and the easiest thing in the world was the last thing on my list. I stood, slow, because the collarbone still didn't allow for anything theatrical, even when the moment seemed to call for it. Marcus rose with me and lifted the car seat. Theo had slept through the destruction of his grandmother's whole story, fist up by his ear, which felt right. My mother was still going. The threats had already started sliding into something softer and worse. The Iris, honey, we're family, we can fix this, you've always been the one who fixes this. But her voice had stopped being able to reach me. You know how a song stops the second you step out of the room it's playing in? It was like that. The account was closed. I stopped in front of Aunt Sharon on the way out. "Thank you for calling Grandpa," I said. "That's all." She nodded, and her eyes were wet, and she squeezed my arm. And I stopped, last, in front of my father, who hadn't lifted his head again. I didn't make him. I leaned down a little, careful of the brace, so only he could hear, and I said, "When you're alone, you can call me. Not with her, just you." His shoulders moved, once. I don't know if it was a sob or just an old man breathing. I straightened up, and I left it there. Because some doors you don't slam and you don't lock, you just leave them open a crack and walk on through your own. Walt folded his survey back into his jacket and got himself up out of the chair with both hands. And the 3 generations my mother least wanted under one roof, the old man, the daughter she'd refused, and the grandson she hadn't driven for, walked out across that beautiful deck into the cold and got in our cars and drove home. I pulled the big sliding door shut behind us softly. Slamming it would have meant I still wanted something from the people on the other side. I didn't. I'd finally finished the audit, and the books balanced, and the answer had been sitting at the bottom of the column the whole time. Here's how it settled, because I know you want to know. The land held. Walt's title was clean, going back 60 years, and his lawyer had drawn the rest tight as a drum. My mother did call 2 attorneys, and both told her, as Walt predicted, that there was nothing to fight. The handshake had never been worth anything, and an 81-year-old with a clear deed and a competent lawyer is not a man you beat in a courtroom. The threats got quiet, then they stopped. My parents took the life estate and moved into the old family cabin a quarter-mile up the shore, which is a good house, warm and small, and it is more than they did for me on the worst night of my life, and I've made my peace with the size of my own mercy. Kyle's lake house sits on land that belongs to my son now, and what happens to it is a conversation for a year when Theo is old enough to have it, and not one day before. Kyle lost the only collateral he had, which was the assumption that someone would always be standing behind him with their credit out. He got a job, an actual one, with a schedule. The last I heard, he was learning, slowly, in his 40s, that a thing you build with your own money sits different under you than a thing somebody builds and then can't take back. I never restarted a single payment. My father's medication I quietly arranged for through a foundation program a social worker helped me find, because I will not put an old man's heart on the curb over what his wife did. But I will also never again let it draft out of an account with my name on it where she can reach it. There's a difference between mercy and access, and it took me 7 years and a car crash to learn it. My father called me once, about 3 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon, just him. I could hear the truck idling in the background, which is the only place he's ever alone, so I understood what it had cost him to dial. He didn't apologize either, not exactly. He's not built for it any more than she taught him to be. What he said was, "I saw your boy's picture. Sharon showed me on her phone. He's got your grandfather's chin." There was a long quiet, the truck rumbling. Then, "You did right, Iris. I should have said so in the room. I've never once said so in any room, and that's the thing I'll be sorry about." I told him he could come meet Theo, alone, whenever he was ready. He said he'd try. He hasn't yet. But he calls now, every few weeks, always from the truck, always alone, and I always answer, because a door left open a crack is still a door, and I've decided I'd rather be the kind of person who keeps one than the kind who learned how to slam them from the woman who raised me. The quilt. The gray quilt Walt brought to my hospital room, the one Eleanor made, the one I'd fallen asleep under as a kid, waiting for parents who were always late. Walt told me to keep it. It lives in Theo's crib now, folded at the foot where he can't get tangled in it, and on cold nights I lay it over him, and every single time my hand smooths it flat, I think about the night I learned which way my wall had been leaning, and the old man who walked in slow with a thermos and refused to let me be cold. Walt comes for Sunday dinner most weeks. The neighbor boy still drives him. He brings the worst coffee in Michigan in that same thermos, and he holds Theo on his knee and tells him, in that gravel voice, the same thing every time. Your great-grandmother could read a room without anybody telling her what was in it. So can your mother. Don't ever let them tell you that's coldness, boy. That's the warmest thing in this family, and they were just too dim to feel it. If there's one thing I carried out of that hospital that's worth more than the land, it's this. And I'll give it to you plain because you've sat with me this long. The people who praise you for being the strong one are usually just naming, out loud, the person they have privately decided they will never have to carry. Strong is the word a family uses for the relative they've quietly voted to lean on forever. And the day you stop being their wall is the day they find out whether they ever loved you or just loved that you held the roof up. Mine found out. Most of them failed the test. One old man and one aunt passed it, and a husband on a freighter passed it the second he got to shore, and that, it turns out, is plenty. You do not need a whole family to show up. You need the few who drive through the dark with a thermos and a dead woman's quilt, because there was never a version of the night where they wouldn't. That's my story. 7 years, a car crash, a single page, and a man who knew his own granddaughter was worth more than the easy quiet of letting it go. If this made you think of someone who's always cast as the strong one, send it to them tonight. And if you are that person, the one who fixes everything, the one who never gets driven for, I want you to do one small thing before you sleep. Check who you'd call from a hospital bed. Really check. Then make sure those are the people getting the best of you, and stop financing the ones who only call when the draft fails. Tell me in the comments who your Walt is, the one who'd actually show up. Hit subscribe so the next person who needs this story finds it, and I'll see you in the next one.